This is someone who is a member of the Royal College of Physicians. He's a neuroscientist who studies, researches the brain, technology, also investigates security. The University College in London, Georgetown University, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He also advises the Pentagon Joint Staff. He works with governments and the private sector, worked as a neurology doctor in London and Oxford, and has published numerous academic papers. It's like reading my own resume when I read his introduction. The BBC, the New York Times have all covered and integrated his research. He's appeared on CNN and the BBC, regularly contributes to outlets like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and Slate. His new book is Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. How about it for the wonderful Nicholas Wright, everyone? Man, you've done a lot, Nick Wright. Congratulations.
It sounds a lot more impressive than it looked from the inside.
Okay,
don't worry about that.
Fair enough. Boy, you seem well positioned to help us evaluate the kind of stressors that we've all endured to some extent, or that many chunks of society and humanity have endured. Tell me about Warhead and about your research and how it works.
Yeah, so as you said, I was a neurology doctor and then spent a number of years using functional brain imaging and other research, sort of really looking at human brains. And then I've also spent now over a decade advising the Pentagon Joint Staff, and I've learned their perspective, how they think about things. And Warhead is bringing those two together and making it understandable for a general audience. And the reason why that's so important right now for the concerned citizen is that right in our time, we could lose, right? The democracies could lose. The United States could lose a war against China. And that's that's literally, I start the book in the preface, I'm sitting in a pub with a friend of mine and he's like, oh, what are you working on? I was like, I'm writing a book about war in the brain. He's like, no one's going to go to war over somewhere like Ukraine or Taiwan. And even if they do, don't worry, America's going to be fine. And I'm like, that's not what they think in the Pentagon. We could lose. And we need to think about the central weapon of war, what has always been the central weapon of war, which is the human brain. And we need to think about it not just because we need to win wars and not lose wars, although that's very important, but also because we have incredible capacity for destruction, and we need to understand why humans fight so that we can try and prevent wars from happening. And if wars do happen, then we can try and prevent wars from escalating. So we need to understand why humans fight. We need that knowledge about ourselves as humans. And I believe that I'm optimistic. I think that if we can build our knowledge of humans, we can build a more peaceful world through better self-knowledge of us as humans. And that makes me optimistic.
Sure. First of all, optimism has no place on this show. I will continue under protest. But I think, of course, you're right. I shouldn't say of course. I mean, I think it's a really decent insight. But it makes sense, I guess, is what I mean, when you say if we know ourselves, we can avoid these conflicts and we can avoid war. And I want to learn more, but just to step out for a second, I would say, problem is, I think that introspection that you're suggesting we need, either culturally, societally, politically, whatever, I don't know that you see a lot of that. It feels as though, particularly in this moment, we see a lot of masculine flex, ego associated with so many decisions, even those decisions involving the military.
I think, look, we need masculine flex to some extent. I mean, that is part of what we need, because we need people who are going to go into the line of fire and stand and fight. So we need something. It doesn't have to be masculine flex, but it needs to be something that is tough and is, and that is not easy. That is not a simple thing for people to do.
But
and
you have to
people
choose
often
that
fail
line
to
of
do that.
fire, right, Professor?
Exactly.
You have to, okay.
This is dangerous and difficult stuff, and I have a huge amount of respect for those people who do it and who I've worked with now for over a decade. But the other thing I'd say is that people are often very negative about people in the Pentagon or people in the US military, and that is just not my experience. Yes, of course, there are some people who are more more reflective than others. But let me give you one tangible example. The very first US flag officer I ever briefed in person in the Pentagon, it was just over 10 years ago. He was a brigadier general. We spent an hour, just me, him, and a couple of his team, and we were talking about the brain. We were talking about Iran. What motivated Iran? How could we come to a better accommodation with Iran if we needed to signal? How could we make them do what we wanted them to do and not accidentally do things we didn't want them to do, and so on. I wrote a book about AI, and he wrote a foreword for that book, right? And now he is the most senior US military officer in Europe. He is the 4-star head of Europe Command and NATO, right? And he is a tough but reflective and intelligent guy. And there are lots of people like that in the American military.
Wow. Thank you for that example. I mean, maybe there really is optimism in all of this. In this moment, one can be optimistic. So, one of the things that historically is the case, and I want to double back to something you said because you're talking about a war with China, et cetera. I kind of feel like a shooting war with China, a hot war with China, maybe over disputed territory. I wonder if that's what you're saying, or what I was getting from you as you were speaking about it was perhaps that a nation can find itself backing into a conflict or involved in a conflict, and before you know it, I mean, you're at war in a way that you didn't think you were. Which one of those things is
I mean,
what
I
you were saying?
think so. So one of the things here is to try and get a complete enough picture of the challenges we face. You can't know everything. As Oscar Wilde said, the problem with socialism is it takes too many evenings. I'm not expecting you to read every book, think about every problem to do with war. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are a number of things we need to think about. So if you think about Taiwan now, you are absolutely right. What we could end up with is an accidental war, a bit like the run up to World War I. None of the great powers, Britain, Germany, Russia, France, none of them really wanted to go to war, certainly not the cataclysmic war that they ended up having. And yet that's what happened. And so, yes, certainly it is possible that America and China could go to war inadvertently over Taiwan. But there is also the possibility, and we must remember this too, that Xi Jinping is an extremely powerful leader. He is the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong in China. China is a very powerful country. It now produces as much as the next 4 or maybe even 9 countries in the world put together in terms of manufacturing. Amazingly sophisticated technologies now too. He could, if he wanted, press the metaphorical button and order an invasion of Taiwan. He has that capability. And if he wants to do that, it will happen. And he could want to do that. That could be his intention. Many people do want to invade other countries or invade other territories because he sees that's part of his own country. Vladimir Putin did want to invade Ukraine, right? Adolf Hitler, and I'm not saying Xi Jinping is Adolf Hitler, but I'm saying Adolf Hitler did want to invade Poland and then France and then Russia. People do want to invade other countries, and there will always be people like that. And Xi Jinping could well be like that. We cannot say that's not possible. It is possible.
And you're saying so the emerging conflict would then find its way to your shores in the United States,
I mean,
or at least a decision about whether or not you're going to be involved in a conflict like that.
I mean, America is a big place, and it seems very far from everywhere else, but that's not really true. Even if you think it, George C. Marshall, you've probably heard of George C. Marshall, the top American military officer in World War II. And he had this thing, Why We Fight. And he was like, look, the Western Hemisphere is actually, even if you take the whole of the Western Hemisphere, the US has every bit of the Western Hemisphere. There are just many more people who live outside the Western Hemisphere than live in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere now is about 13% of the world's population, and the geography is not what most people think. So Houston, Texas is closer geographically to me now in London than it is to Buenos Aires, right? The Western Hemisphere is very long. And also America may get no choice, right? Pearl Harbor was not America deciding to sink the aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy who felt threatened by the United States. What the United States could choose to do, regardless of what the US was doing, what it could choose to do, and they attacked the United States. That's what Pearl Harbor was. Why would countries not worry about what the United States could choose to do?
Wow, fascinating, and it puts it in a context. And so, with your book, you get into the thinking of the neurology, really, the thinking, I suppose, how that manifests philosophically in the way we behave, how war takes shape in the human brain. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what war is. War is politically motivated violence at scale between human groups. It is fundamentally human. It's part of what we are. And so the book takes you on a journey. It starts at the brain stem, right at the very bottom of the brain, and goes through many different brain areas and ends right up at the frontal pole, right at the other end, that does our most sophisticated thinking about thinking. That's the most uniquely human area of the brain. But every part of the brain that we journey through can drive us towards war. So to give you an example, the amygdala is a region quite deep down in the brain, and it's involved in fear. Now we think of fear as something we don't necessarily want, but fear is useful. We need fear. If you don't have fear, right? So there are some very rare patients who lose the amygdala. They lose this little part of the brain that's involved in fear. And some of those patients can't feel fear and they don't recognize fear in others. And that doesn't make them some kind of fearless criminal who can take whatever they want and get everything without, worrying about the consequences. What that makes them is a victim of crime. We need fear. Fear is useful. And yet fear can, when two groups fear each other or two people fear each other, that can drive them towards conflict. So that's
Sure.
just one example. There's so much about our brains that drives us towards conflict. But if we understand how that works, then, and we understand how we can make wiser decisions, not just cleverer decisions, but wiser decisions, then we can do better than our forebears did. And we can hopefully build a more peaceful world.
Are human beings biologically, neurologically wired to be aggressive creatures?
I think yes, it is part of us. It is not all of us, and it's very important to remember that reconciliation, for example, is every bit as human as conflict. But we must not pretend about ourselves that violence isn't and conflict is not a part of us. That's just not a, we don't have the luxury of living with an incomplete picture. To give you an example, the two biggest books of the last 15, 20 years on the brain and war, one was Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Don't worry, guys, the arc of history bends towards peace. I'm obviously paraphrasing. He's a very intelligent, very clever guy. But the thing is that he's not so much wrong. The arc of history probably does bend towards peace. It's a dangerously incomplete picture of the world because wars do happen and they don't win themselves, and we need to really think about that. Like Ukraine or Robert Sapolsky. Don't worry, guys. The way we're going to crack the problem of war, and he wrote a brilliant book, about the brain and violence. But the way we're going to crack it is just by being nice to each other, or nicer to each other, and realizing war is bad. Well, yes, war is bad, but that doesn't help us, understand how to prevent wars and win wars if we must fight them. And that's what I try and do in the book is walk through the brain, understand all the different major things about the brain and how the brain works, and then how that can drive us towards war, how it can help us create peace, and how it can help us win wars and not lose wars.
It's just a fascinating science that you've applied to what feels as though it's human nature. Human nature is an area of scientific discourse and investigation, one that you've been intimately involved in.
Yeah.
And is your research, the productivity that you found, the results that you found, the conclusions that you've reached, is that the result of anecdotal looking at the subset of humanity that you look at, the history, which you're obviously so very well steeped in? I would think it's more that than it is, the kind of laboratory experimental psych that I'm used to.
The whole of the book, the whole idea is to bring those two worlds together. That's I think exactly the idea of the book. There are, and that's why, for example, like the people who very kindly said, "Oh, it's a great book, buy this book," the endorsements on the book jack and whatever. It's leading scholars of war, historians of war, really leading thinkers on war, and at the other side, people who are hardcore neuroscientists, among the top 10 most cited neuroscientists in the world. Those are the two different worlds I've tried to bring together and bring those two sources of evidence together, because often if you can bring two very different sources of evidence together, you can really create something new and different and fresh. And you see both things better than if you just stick with your normal perspectives that you always have. Human nature can be studied. We've studied it in the lab, and I've tried to apply that knowledge to how we think about human nature in the most difficult circumstances, which is war.
Let me share a couple of quick notions about your book that did make it into my press kit. Truly original and unfortunately timely. Wright combines brain science, history, and psychology to challenge our views on war and peace. Would understanding the mind help bring peace or help nations fight better? Perhaps both. Fresh, engaging, and provocative. Wow, that's from the author of The Influential Mind. A fresh neuroscientific exploration of the science of war. Warhead is for anyone who thinks conflict is explained by cold reason and analysis rather than by understanding our imperfect brains. That's from the distinguished professor at the Free University of Brussels and author of Flawed Strategy, Why Smart Leaders Make Bad Decisions. These are other very smart and students of letters, that is to say authors, who are opining on your book. Wow, it's really getting some great reception. And I congratulate you on it. I mean, it sounds like some sort of breakthrough conclusions that you're reaching. And I like the way in which you understand or seem to understand kind of the warring nature of human beings, but also the way in which that can be defused such that we understand it and then end up in a place where we're not actually at war.
Yeah, I mean, and that is our goal. As a human species, our goal is not to fight wars. Our goal, I mean, we have many goals. We can choose our goals, but it's to be constructive. It's to build new things. War will always be a part of that, partly just because we're driven towards war through fear and all sorts of things and misunderstandings and so on. But also because we're constantly so vibrant, so creative. Each new generation comes along and it feels that what it's inherited is the boring status quo. And because of that vibrancy, there will always be competition, and that competition can get out of hand. But hopefully, if we understand ourselves better, we can keep a lid on some of that competition. We can walk back from some of the most dangerous paths we might be going down. And that matters within our societies, within our everyday lives as well, in our families and so on. Like, for example, if you ask the question, what do I really want? You win the argument with your partner, but what is that really winning the war, as it were? Sometimes it's better not to win the argument. It sounds obvious, but this is something people do. They Adolf Hitler kept winning battles, but he did not win the war, thank goodness. So I hope we can make a better world, and I'm optimistic that we can if we have better self-knowledge.
I have a confession to make, which is that through much of what you've said in certain instances, I apply it to domestic kinds of arguments one might have, or just interpersonal relations that one might have that seem fraught with all kinds of similar problems to the ones that you referred to. So it's very apt that you had mentioned it as well. Warhead is the book, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, by Nicholas Wright. Dr. Nicholas Wright is, again, a leading neuroscientist, advisor to the Pentagon. It is a fascinating work, well celebrated at this point, and there'll be a link to it. You can buy it and connect with it under this video. What a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for joining us from far away. And for an Oscar Wilde quote, I'll give you a ding. That was very strong. Yeah.
Possibly apocryphal, like every other quote that one looks up now on the internet. So I apologize. It's like quote investigator.
I thought it was quite special. Quite special. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Nicholas Wright. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.